I'm on there. We have Dan Orr joining us tonight. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he's been around the diving industry for 50 years. Um, I've only been diving for like 10. So, yeah, he's had 5 decades in the diving industry, recreational, commercial, scientific, and military. He began his career in retail diving and later developed diver education courses and safety programs at Florida State and Wright State universities. He's played a crucial role in establishing the Divers Alert Network oxygen program. Literally, I believe, wrote the book on it, setting the standards for administering emergency oxygen. He was also, and I don't know if they named it after him, but Divers Alert Network,
No.
Dan, um, president for 23 years. He retired in 2013. He's an author, educator, published numerous articles, and so on. He's in the Disabled Divers Hall of Fame, DEMA Hall of Fame, International Scuba Diving Hall of Fame, the NAUI Hall of Honor. His wife is a member of the Women Divers Hall of Fame. I mean, these are you guys are like diving royalty, which is really exciting. And so, he's developed programs and speaking to dive clubs around the world because he's spent so much time in the diving industry, seeing the mistakes divers make and that kind of thing. And so he's going to bring that to us tonight. And I'm going to turn this around.
Okay.
Let me, can't get everybody in there. So, hey, how are you?
Okay.
Probably
Well,
part of this. Okay, Dan, it's all yours, and hopefully we'll check the volume. Go ahead.
hey, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see my email address. And actually, I'll be showing that again at the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions about just about anything actually related to the diving world, drop me an email. I'll be happy to share the knowledge that I have and answer whatever questions you have. And I spend actually quite a bit of time doing those kinds of things because as Jennifer mentioned, I'm involved in a lot of different things in the diving industry. I worked for Divers Alert Network for 23 years. And now that and I'll use air quotes when I do this, now that I'm retired, I actually do a lot of volunteer work. So I do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations. I'm the chairman of the board of DEMA, the Trade Association of Diving, chairman of the board of Force Blue, which is a special operations veterans group, chairman of the board of Best Publishing Company. And so I'm involved in quite a few things, and I'll be happy to do whatever I can to help you answer any questions you may have about almost anything. So tonight we're talking about mistakes that divers make. And having been involved in the diving community for a long time, in fact, this year I think I've been certified for 61 years, I think, and been in the diving industry for pretty close to most of that time. So again, I'm involved in quite a few things. This, by the way, is a shipwreck in Antarctica because one of the things that I do is to help lead expeditions for a company called Blue Green Expeditions out of Oregon. And in 2018, I was invited to help on an expedition they did to the Antarctic that was partly science and partly diving expedition. And this is a shipwreck called the Governor Norrin. The Governor Norrin was a whaling ship, a whaling factory ship that caught fire in 1915. And in order to save whatever cargo and whale oil they had, and to save the crew as well as any passengers they had, they ran it aground. So it's in relatively shallow water, and it's a great place to dive, despite the fact that the water temperature is pretty close to 28 degrees. So it is pretty cold. I'm doing my best to try to smile there. So, talking about diving, and we'll talk about the fact that for some reason or other, wonder why it's frozen. Hold on a sec. Here we go. So we'll talk about the fact that scuba diving is inherently safe. And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about that safe word a bit, because there's been a lot of question about whether diving really is safe. When I worked at Divers Alert Network, we would get phone calls constantly from news media every time there was some sort of a diving accident somewhere, and they would say, well, is diving really safe? And when Divers Alert Network was out looking for an insurance program, we went to insurance companies around North America and we said, we'd like to insure scuba divers. And after they stopped laughing, they said, no, we don't do that because the fact that scuba diving is not safe. And we said, no, it is safe. And so then people would say, well, prove it. The problem is we couldn't prove it. And actually, nobody could prove it because in order to prove it, you have to have an incident of injury, which requires you to know the number of accidents you have and the number of safe dives you have. And the problem is that nobody had that denominator. Nobody had an idea of how many safe dives were being done, not only in North America, but all over the world. So what we decided to do was to launch a program to determine what the incidence of injury was. And what we would do is we would actually go to various dive platforms and we would send interns to various places around the diving world to collect information about diving injuries and accidents related to dives people were making. So what they would do, the interns would be on, let's say, for example, a liveaboard. And what they would do is when the dives are over, they would download the information from the dive computers, store that information, and then follow the divers post dive and post trip to see if they had any symptoms or any injuries related to the dives they made. So during the time the interns were on a liveaboard, they collected nearly 20,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was about 1 per 10,000 open water dives. Now, in my opinion, that is sort of the safe baseline. And it's a safe baseline partly because of the dive platform. I mean, for example, you're diving from a liveaboard that literally can park itself right over top of a dive site. And you simply go down into the water, come back up to the liveaboard. You don't have to do a whole lot of work to dive there. Plus, also, there are people on board that liveaboard who are really only there for your benefit and your safety. There are people who give you information about the dive site so that you and your diving companions can make decisions for your dive plan and your dive profile to make sure everything is being done safely. You also have people there that help you configure your equipment, help you put your equipment on if necessary. And we also have people on liveaboards who are actually in the water with you. And these dive guides or dive masters are there in case something happens, they're there to help you. The same thing applies to people diving from day charters that have a dive master on board and possibly dive masters in the water or dive guides in the water with you. And they also give you the information you need to make your decisions relative to your dive plan. And so, again, this is what we would consider, what I would consider the safe baseline 1 per 10,000 open water dives. We then sent interns to places where they could track dives from people diving from shore or diving from their own personal watercraft. And we collected over 16,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was about 3 times higher. And when you think about it, that makes some sense because these people, the people diving from shore or from these personal watercraft, they're responsible now for doing everything on their own. So they're responsible for gathering all the information they need for their dive plan. They're responsible for checking their equipment to make sure everything is done. They're responsible for getting all the information about the dive site they're going to dive in. So sometimes we make mistakes, and we'll talk more about that as we go through, but the incidence of injury is about 3 times higher. We then sent interns to track information and download dive profiles from people who would be considered dive professionals. And these are people who would be instructors or assistant instructors or dive masters or dive guides who have responsibility for the safety and training of people in the water. And we collected about 5,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was about 10 times higher. And that makes some sense because when you think about the fact that these folks are doing multiple ascents and descents during training exercises, they may be moving quickly and rapidly up and down in the water column to help somebody who may be having trouble. And so because of that, the risk is higher. When I worked at Florida State, I was the associate dive safety officer there at Florida State. And when we were there, we were actually training and evaluating science divers almost every day. So almost every day, I had my staff actually out in the Gulf in water that was about 50 feet deep, doing training and evaluation exercises with diving scientists. And so, in order for them to be safer and for us to mitigate the risk they may have, I actually had them breathing nitrox using air dive tables. Now, we'll talk more about that later on as we go through this presentation. We also then collected information from dive profiles for people who you would consider them technical divers now, cold water, deep wreck divers who are really pushing the edge of the envelope. And we collected over 5,000 dive profiles there. And the incidence of injury was about 29 times higher. And when you think about it, of course, this was a few years ago when we didn't have some of the more sophisticated algorithms now we have for dive computers, but they were doing deep, cold work dives, wreck dives, and the incidence of injury was higher, as I mentioned. And the fact that they can nowadays mitigate those risks by using alternative gas mixtures, doing lengthy decompression stops, using mixed gases, using oxygen, for example, using different dive computers with more conservative algorithms. So a lot of different things to mitigate those risks, but still the risk is higher doing that kind of diving. Unfortunately, we do have to talk about fatalities, and on average, there are about 100 or so fatalities in the diving world every year. In this particular year, which I believe was 2018, there were 55 who were from the U.S. and Canada, and about 45 from the rest of the world, for about 100 fatalities that were purely in recreational diving. And the fatality numbers are there's a risk of fatality, one fatality in every 211, 864 dives. That was data that was determined by Divers Alert Network. And by the way, it was not named after me. In fact, the original name was Diving Accident, or actually, the original name was International Diving Accident Network. And so they changed it over time to Divers Alert Network. Okay, now let's talk about other things because human beings are very resourceful and we sometimes do a lot of things to get ourselves in trouble. So let's talk about some of these other sports and the risk of a fatality. So the odds of dying are one in every 200, excuse me, one in every 2,317 for people doing base jumping. Now, base jumping means, of course, you're jumping out of an aircraft or off of a tall building or off of a cliffside and with a wingsuit and you're zipping along the air, hopefully landing safely.
You might question the sanity of these two guys who decided to pull off an illegal urban wingsuit stunt in Rio de Janeiro. As you can see, the men were Red Bull wingsuit daredevils. They actually successfully threaded the needle between two skyscrapers in Rio. One of the daredevils attempted to fly by one of Brazil's famous monuments. Fortunately for him, that was
no, that's one of the things you really don't expect. But base jumping isn't necessarily a safe activity. So swimming, the odds of dying in swimming is one out of every 56,000 or so. Odds of dying cycling is one out of every 92,000 or so. The odds of dying with skydiving is one out of every 101,000 or so. And I certainly do not want to look out the window of my plane and see that. Hang gliding, one out of every 116,000. Horse riding, one out of every 175,000. I live in the state of Idaho. And in Idaho, we have a lot of snow. In fact, there's a lot of snow on the ground around my house right now. We're also a horse state, and we're also a skiing state. And so what do you do in the wintertime? But you combine all those into something that they call ski joring. In fact, I took that photograph last weekend in the local ski joring competition they had, where people are being pulled behind a horse on skis or snowboards. And of course, you can find a way of getting yourself hurt doing almost anything. Scuba diving, as we talked about, one out of every 211,864. Table tennis, one out of every 250,597. So in reality, the odds of dying while scuba diving are somewhere between riding a horse and playing table tennis. So to me, that indicates that scuba diving is indeed a safe sport. So as we talked about, scuba diving is inherently safe, but it can be very, very unforgiving of mistakes, partly because we're diving in a very unforgiving environment. So we need to make sure that we minimize the likelihood of a mistake. So why do divers make mistakes? Having incomplete knowledge, not having all of the relevant facts that we need to formulate a safe and enjoyable dive plan, and to make all the decisions we have to make during a dive. So we need to have all the knowledge that we can in order to make those decisions. Poor communication, not sharing all the relevant information with your diving companions. So you need to be able to communicate with all the people that you dive with to make sure that everybody's on the same dive plan if you are all together on one dive plan, and to make sure at least your dive buddy, you are both on this dive plan. Also, changing conditions, because the conditions don't always remain exactly the same throughout the entire dive. And sometimes those conditions can change to the point where it really pushes the edge of your personal safety envelope and then create unexpected circumstances or unfamiliar circumstances that can put a lot of stress on you during a dive. So pressure. Pressure is also an issue. Now, we're not talking about water pressure here, but we are talking about things, for example, like time pressure, because when people are continually pushing you along to move quickly, get things done in a hurry, that's a formula for making mistakes. And I tend to be very slow, very methodical about my preparation for dives to make sure that I minimize the likelihood of making a mistake. So you want to make sure that people don't push you to move faster than you're comfortable with. And that same thing goes for being underwater. Because there's a lot of times when people are pushing you. I was diving in Japan a couple of years ago, and we had dive masters there that were constantly scolding my buddy and I because we were moving very slowly. We wanted to move slowly and enjoy the dive rather than having to keep up with everybody else. So you need to be able to move at your own pace. Peer pressure. Peer pressure is when somebody tries to convince you to do something that you don't feel you are fully prepared for. And that can be deadly. There are a number of situations that I'm aware of where people were convinced to do a dive when they really weren't fully prepared or qualified to do that dive. And somebody said, don't worry, I'll take care of you. And of course, that's a dangerous thing to hear from anybody, because that means that somebody is not as qualified as they should be for the dive they're going to make. Also, equipment preparation pressure, and that really had more to do with people who are underwater photographers, because they're always fiddling with their gear. And they need to make sure that not only are they fiddling with their camera gear, but they need to make sure that all of their other scuba gear is all configured the way it should be and all prepared for the kind of dive that you're going to be doing. So I have what I call my rule of three. Now, my rule of three is if I make three mistakes, three preparation mistakes during my dive preparation, I stop, take a deep breath, and I rethink my readiness for that dive. When I do dives in the Antarctic, I've been to the Antarctic 3 times on these expeditions, and we're lucky enough on the research vessel that we have to have an empty helicopter hangar that we can dress out in, which is at least out of the wind and somewhat heated, so it's somewhat comfortable. And sometimes when we're doing these dives, I'll actually go up to that hangar an hour and a half or 2 hours before the dive is set to begin, to make sure I'm taking my time preparing my equipment and preparing myself for the dives that we're going to make. Because of course you need to make sure that if you're in places as remote as the Antarctic, that you want to make sure there are no mistakes, because you are literally days away from any kind of assistance. So going on, complexity, overly complex equipment, procedures, and circumstances, because sometimes you're doing something different than you've done before, or using some equipment you've not used before, and in circumstances you may not be familiar with. So for example, the first time I was going to dive in the Antarctic, since I'd never been diving in those kind of conditions before, I made sure I went down to Ushuaia, Argentina, which is our departure point for the trip to Antarctica, and spent a couple of days there diving in the Beagle Channel using the equipment I'd be using in the Antarctic, to make sure I was completely comfortable with that equipment before I was 2 days away from any assistance in the Antarctic Peninsula. Too many firsts. That means too many first time doing something. So doing something for the very first time, using something for the very first time. And you need to make sure that if you're doing something differently, that you take your time and make sure you understand how everything works using those new techniques or that new equipment. Or the first time in a long time using or doing something. This was really relevant post-COVID, because there were a lot of people who stayed out of the water for quite a long time during COVID, during the pandemic. Or there are people, and I'll talk about one later on, that's been out of the water for quite a long time. And so if you've been out of the water for a long time, you need to make sure that you realize your skills get rusty. And so it's not a good idea to complicate that first dive with things, for example, like carrying a camera. I make a personal habit of not taking my camera on the first dive, even if it's a place I've been diving before, because I want to make sure I'm comfortable with being in the water, comfortable with people I'm diving with, and don't complicate things and increase the stress and reduce the enjoyment of the dive. And there is something called task loading. Task loading is where all these things are going on at one time. And so you're having a difficult time dealing with all of this stuff. And as a result, you get something called perceptual narrowing. Now, perceptual narrowing is almost like tunnel vision, where you can only see those things that are directly in your field of focus. And that, of course, limits your opportunities and limits your options. And you get something called response narrowing that actually does limit your options of things and how to deal with the situation if something were to happen. So for example, things, for example, like getting rid of your weights, things, for example, like the exchange of breathing gas underwater. Those are complex psychomotor skills, and they can only be used if they've been recently reinforced and practiced. So response narrowing means you can only use skills that have been recently reinforced and practiced. So reinforcement and practice of your skills is essential as far as dive safety is concerned. Okay, we'll talk about the mistakes. Now, not practicing critical diving and emergency skills. So from the Divers Alert Network data, about 39% of the people who were in the fatality database were certified for 1 year or less. Now, when you think about that, that makes some sense because of the fact that they have limited skills and background and experience to draw from in case something happens. So therefore, they're probably at greater risk. 35% of the people in the fatality database were certified for more than 10 years. Now, I can tell you that means absolutely nothing. All it means is that these people were carrying a certification card in their wallet or their purse for 10 years or longer. And I hear this kind of stuff all the time, you know, because I travel around quite a bit and I don't necessarily travel with my dive buddy, and I have to make a buddy relationship when I'm in these other areas. And so I'll be talking to people and they say, well, you know, I've been diving. They tell me they've been diving for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. Well, that means nothing to me. I want to know when your last dive was. I want to know something about those experiences you've had and how recent experiences you've had, because that's really what's more important rather than just carrying your certification card for a number of years. Also, a significant number of divers in the fatality database died on the first dive of their dive trip. Now, I was giving this presentation or a similar one not too long ago, and somebody said, well, the way to deal with that is simply to skip the first dive. Well, that may sound logical, but it doesn't really work that way. But also, that makes some sense because a lot of those people are people who had not been in the water in a long time, or people who hadn't been in that area in a long time or ever. So therefore, they're a little stressed out, they're a little nervous, and all of a sudden they jump in the water, something goes wrong, and they have a hard time dealing with it and ends up in a fatality. Here's a guy in the picture there who's entering the water, and he does not have his hand on his mask. And if he hits the water, that mask could flood. And if it floods, that sometimes is enough to start a cascade of events that ends up in an injury or fatality. So, case history. Okay, this is a case history about a diver who ran out of air, ran out of breathing gas in 60 feet of water. Now, this was an absolutely perfect dive day. Flat calm, no wave action whatsoever, no current. Visibility was at least 100 feet. This was a group of divers who were diving together. They had what we would call the same ocean buddy system, so there was no defined buddy relationships during this dive. The buddy, and I got buddy in air quotes there because the buddy was simply somebody who was nearby. The buddy was somebody who saw this person having a problem and had run out of air, and so they were swimming over to them to help. They attempted to share air. This was the second dive of the day. The diver and the buddy were found dead on the bottom later on that day. The buddy still had 1,200 psi in her cylinder. So what could have happened? This was a second dive of the day, and that's very, very important. Possible issues here: no recent familiarity with critical skills, especially the exchange of breathing gas underwater, because evidently that did not work. No pre-dive equipment check, because that could have identified the fact that somebody did not have sufficient air for the dive. No use of a checklist or a pre-dive ritual that we'll talk more about later on. And this person did not change cylinders between dives. And unfortunately, there are a number of situations that this happened to. In fact, there was a guy not too long ago in the Florida Keys, same way, who decided to make the second dive of the day without changing cylinders, ran out of breathing gas to 100 feet of water, and of course died on the dive. But changing cylinders is a critical issue. And every time I hear about the fact that two people have died or multiple people have died and one still has air in their cylinder, the first thing I ask, what dive of the day was it? And generally speaking, it's the second dive of the day. Now, this is a photo that I took at a dive site in North Carolina a number of years ago. And this guy came out of the water, and I walked up to him and I said, can I take your photograph? He said, yes. And I wanted to look at his configuration of his equipment. He had his pressure gauge under the chest strap of his buoyancy compensator. He's had his octopus here under the chest strap of his buoyancy compensator. So if you can imagine being in front of that person and you are out of breathing gas and you want breathing gas in an emergency, that person's not going to be able to deploy that octopus quickly enough to satisfy your need for breathing gas. And what are you going to do? You're probably going to reach over and grab the regulator right out of his mouth. And in fact, this is a photo of somebody who's lost control of their own second stage, and you cannot allow that to happen. So you need to make sure you practice those skills so if something happens and somebody is out of breathing gas, then you can satisfy their need right away, quickly and efficiently. Now, in 2008, Divers Alert Network did, I think, what was one of the best research projects they ever did, and that was to review the records of 947 fatality cases from our fatality database. And these were fatality cases between 1992 and 2003. And the reason we looked at that section of time was because those are the records that had all the information necessary to determine really what happened. And this was a paper that was published in 2008 by Dr. Petar Denoble. And if you would like a copy of that paper, when this presentation's over, drop me an email and I'll be happy to send you a copy of that paper. So what I was looking at actually were the trigger events. So what triggered an enjoyable recreational dive to become a dive that ended in a fatality? And so I looked at the trigger events. The number one trigger event was running out of breathing gas underwater. 41% of the fatality triggering events were people running out of breathing gas underwater. That means that it could be 400 people alive today if they knew how to manage their breathing gas. And it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. With the equipment we have, pressure gauges and air integrated BCDs or air integrated computer systems, we should never be in a situation where we run out of breathing gas underwater. When you look at all of the different triggering events, you have out of breathing gas, you have entrapment where somebody is in an area they shouldn't be or not qualified to be, equipment problems. Equipment problems to me is not the issue. In my mind, it's problems with equipment because in the records that I've looked at, it's mainly user error. It's not equipment design problems. It's not some problem with the equipment configuration. It really is how people use the equipment that causes the problem. And when you look at all of these triggering events, 63% of those have to do with equipment in some way or form. So if we can find ways of being able to eliminate equipment issues, equipment problems, or problems with equipment, I think we can reduce fatalities significantly. Now, looking at more DAN data, these are fatality records of people who had a number of dives in the 12 months prior to the fatal accident. So when you look at that graph on the left-hand side, you can see that people that had fewer than 20 open water dives were at greatest risk. And again, we talked about that earlier, and that makes some sense because they have limited experience to draw from if something were to happen and a crisis were to occur during a dive. Now, on the other end, you have people who have made more than 300 open water dives in the 12 months prior to an accident, and they still ended up in the fatality database. And you scratch your head and say, how in the world can that happen? Well, complacency. At least that's one of the issues. I think these people feel that their skills are so good because they're diving so frequently that they don't have to follow the same procedures you and I do to get ourselves fully prepared for a dive. And we'll talk more about that later in something called normalization of deviance. So this is what I call the cascade towards eternity. This came from that research report that I just mentioned, where you have a triggering event that causes something to go terribly wrong, where someone is injured or harmed in some way, they're then incapacitated, and then there is a cause of death. Now, what we want to do is to be able to stop it right there. So whenever there's a trigger event, and when you think about the dives you make, every single dive we make, there really is a triggering event. I mean, somebody may swim by you, bump into you, flood your mask, or something may cause you to lose control of your regulator for a minute, or your buoyancy is slightly out of control, or something. Something happens that we have to deal with. And because of the fact that we are qualified and experienced and our skills are the way they should be, we solve that problem and go on, and we never really think about it as being the triggering event that could lead to something more serious. So if we stop it there, it's actually going to stop that whole cascade from occurring. Another mistake, not using a pre-dive checklist or a consistent pre-dive ritual. Case history, diver attempted to put air in his BCD during an emergency. No air would go into the BC. So no air would come out of the cylinder, even though there was air in the cylinder. No air would come out of the cylinder into the BCD. The diver drowned. Possible issues, the BCD inflator was not completely connected. So the hose, the inflator hose, and the nipple on the power inflator were touching each other, but it wasn't pushed in all the way, so air would come out of the cylinder into the BCD. So when that person pushed the button on their BCD, nothing happened, and they couldn't deal with it and ended up drowning. There was no pre-dive equipment check that could have made sure that didn't happen. There was no checklist or pre-dive ritual, again, to make sure that didn't happen. So you need to prepare yourself and your diving, your partners, your companions, and your equipment with a checklist or a consistent pre-dive ritual. Consistent pre-dive ritual is something that you do over and over and over and over again. And that's something that I do. I have a checklist to make sure everything is where it should be, but I also have a consistent ritual that I use. And I'll tell you about the ritual here. I have what I call my safety cross. And so people see me on the boat crossing myself. I'm not praying. And if I have to pray, I probably shouldn't be doing the dive. But this is what I do. I'll check to make sure that my breathing gas is on, my regulator's in my mouth. Check. I check to make sure that my weights are on and adjusted properly. Check. I make sure that my pressure gauge is where it should be. And what I do, I look at the pressure gauge and I breathe through the regulator simultaneously to see if the needle fluctuates. And if the needle fluctuates, that means that the cylinder is not open all the way. I was in Cuba in December, and my diving companion and I were swimming along the bottom. We noticed that somebody had stopped on the bottom and was looking at a pressure gauge. I swam over to her and I looked at her pressure gauge, and every time she took a breath, the needle fluctuated back and forth. So I reached behind her, turned the air on all the way because it was not on all the way, and everything was fine from that point forward. So I checked the pressure gauge to make sure it's on and the air is on and everything is working properly. Check. And then I go and check my octopus to make sure it's where it should be. The inflator is on. I can push the button. Air comes out of my cylinder into the BCD. So everything is working properly. Check. And I'm ready to dive. Dive your recent experience. Your recent experience is so important because that recent experience reinforces all of those critical skills. Your certification card is important because that's your ticket to be able to go diving. It has nothing to do with your skills. No matter what it says on that certification card, it has nothing to do with your skills and abilities. And so when I'm traveling around the world diving and people show me the certification card, I just want to make sure they have one, that they are certified. But that really means not much to me at all because it has nothing to do with that person's recent abilities or skills. Because those recently practiced skills and experiences are essential, because once you're underwater, that certification card means absolutely nothing. Properly execute each dive as a buddy team, considering contingencies. My buddy and I spent a lot of time talking about, well, if something like this happened, what would we do? What were your experiences? Where did you dive the last time? Did you have any problems with this or that? And so we tend to talk a lot, really prepare ourselves for the dives we're going to make. Be situationally aware. In fact, I write monthly articles for a magazine called Scuba Diving Industry Magazine. Actually, it's a free magazine. You can get a free subscription by going to their website. But I write a monthly dive safety article, and the last 2 months I've written about situational awareness. So situational awareness has to do with people who are diving and being aware of all the things that are going on around them. So, for example, I pointed out this one diver actually has a loose strap on the BCD. That could indicate a problem. So you need to be aware of all the things that are going on once you're in the water and even before you get in the water. So being situationally aware includes being aware of everything during the equipment preparation phase, the dive, and even post-dive. So being aware of things, for example, like your breathing gas, because you have a limited supply of breathing gas, and you need to make sure that you have communicated with your diving companions as to when you're going to be turning the dive. So do you turn at a third of your air supply, half your air supply, or what do you do? That needs to be communicated to all the people you dive with, and you communicate it while you're diving to each other to make sure that you're using the appropriate hand signals. Bottom time relative to your dive plan, because you do have bottom time and you want to make sure you don't go beyond the bottom time, because that's going to significantly increase your risk. You can make your bottom time shorter if you wish, but you can't go beyond that as part of your dive plan. You need to be aware of the depth that you're going to, because you want to make sure you don't violate the dive plan. If you do go beyond the planned depth, of course, and you need to make some modifications in your dive plan, and that could include shorter bottom time, doing longer safety stops, or a number of different things. So you need to be aware of those things. Current, if you have any current, because if there's current changes during the dive, that could cause you to do more work. And if you do more work, you're breathing more gas. You're also increasing your likelihood or susceptibility to things like decompression sickness. Surge can also create some additional workload. Visibility, that can also create some stress, for example, or cause you not to be able to keep track of the people you're diving with as easily. You need to make sure you understand where your entry and exit point are, because you want to make sure you don't have a long distance swim across the surface back to the point of your exit. Workload. Anytime you have an additional amount of work that you're doing during the dive, again, you're breathing more gas. That can actually limit your bottom time. It can also increase the amount of nitrogen your body's absorbing, so therefore it can increase the risk of decompression sickness. You can see this photo there. The person has a leak that's not coming out of the second stage. It's actually coming out of the connector there at the buoyancy compensator and power inflator hose. And that could mean a bad O-ring. That could be potentially serious issues. So that should be corrected. Also, you see the person is in nearly an upright position in the water. That means their buoyancy control is not as it should be. Overhead conditions, because you want to make sure you don't go into an overhead environment unless you are trained and qualified to do that, because of course the risk can significantly increase. And there are also conditions where there are what I will call a virtual overhead. So when I was in the Philippines not too long ago, we were diving from shore and there was a lot of boat traffic. So we had to treat that as an overhead environment, because it was dangerous to surface out there in the middle of all that boat traffic, even though we did have a dive flag. So we treated it as an overhead environment dive where we did a third of our air supply going out, third coming back, and a third in reserve. Also, you need to make sure you do have that dive flag. And this is a photo of a guy. He actually had a GoPro mounted on his mask. He was spearfishing off the coast of Florida, and he surfaced and he heard a noise, turned around, and that's what he saw on his GoPro, a speeding boat coming directly at his head. And so luckily he was able to bounce off of that hull, so it only caused a head injury rather than being hit by the propeller. In fact, actually, I just got a news article today about a guy also in the state of Florida who was hit by a boat and caused a severe damage because the boat propeller had hit him and caused some severe gashes in his legs, but he survived, luckily. Okay, anything that could compromise your safety. So situational awareness, again, is actually something we do in our daily lives anyway. I mean, we look at things around us, we understand what's going on around us. If we see something that could be a potential risk, then we can avoid that, and we can maybe adjust our dive in order to make an avoidance of that particular issue and make sure that the dive continue as a safe dive and an enjoyable dive. Learn from each and every dive. We tend to do that. We want to make sure that anytime there's a mistake, we of course talk about it to make sure that we learn from that, because every single person makes mistakes. Every diver makes a mistake. And we don't waste those good mistakes. We learn from it and we share that learning experience with others. Okay, not taking care of your health. This to me is probably the biggest safety issue in diving that we have today. As I mentioned before, this was the information we got from the research project that was done by Divers Alert Network in 2008. And the number one triggering event was running out of breathing gas underwater, as we talked about. In 2015, Dan looked at another group of diving fatalities to see if the triggering events had changed. And lo and behold, they had. The number one triggering event now is underlying health issues. And a lot of those are cardiac related. So underlying health issues is a real serious problem in diving. Case history, 54-year-old certified advanced diver. Now, advanced diver, of course, was what was on his certification card, and that all depends upon whether or not he really still has advanced skills. This person was making the first open water dive in 7 years. So even though the certification card he carried says an advanced diver, his skills certainly were not advanced after having been out of the water for 7 years. When he entered the water with a snorkel in his mouth, not his regulator. And the first full breath he took was 100% salt water. He struggled on the surface, became unresponsive. Possible issues here, a cardiac event, no recent physical, no recent cardiac evaluation. Now, question is, could a refresher course have helped? Absolutely, in my opinion. I think if you've been out of the water that long, the appropriate thing to do would be to take an easy approach back into the water, and a refresher course is certainly a good way to do that. Now, looking at cardiac issues in diving, in 2017, Dan published some information about autopsy results that were available in 29 of the diving-related fatalities. Now, even though there might have been 40 or 50 fatalities in the Dan database, only a few of them really have autopsies done by people who understand what to look for in a diving fatality. So he had 29 autopsy results that were available here, and in 16 of those, or 55.2%, they identified the cause of death or disabling condition was identified as an acute cardiac event. And diving exposes our bodies to various stressors simply by being in the water that may contribute to an arrhythmia or an irregular heartbeat that could precipitate a cardiac event. These major stressors are immersion, exposure to cold, increased work of breathing. That's diving. So there's nothing we can do to mitigate the risk of immersion. I don't want to virtually dive. I want to really be in the water. We can help mitigate that risk of exposure to cold by having the appropriate exposure protection. So whether you're diving in the Antarctic where the water is 28 degrees, or diving in the Caribbean where the water is 80 degrees or more, or in the Gulf when the water temperature could be as high as 90 degrees, that's still colder than your body temperature, and it's probably not a bad idea to have some form of exposure protection. Now let's talk briefly about the last one, this increased work of breathing. In October of last year, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the British Subaquia Club's annual national convention in Birmingham, England. And I gave a presentation similar to this. And afterwards, a number of people came up to me and they asked me about something that you don't hear often about in the United States. and that is immersion pulmonary edema. And in the UK, they spell it with an O. So it's instead of IPE in the US, it's IPO in the UK. So what is immersion pulmonary edema? Well, in scuba divers and snorkelers, it is definitely an underreported, potentially life-threatening, rapid onset condition that occurs when fluids from the blood leak from the small blood vessels around the lung air sacs into the air spaces or into the alveoli. So you get a condition that is similar to pneumonia, where fluids are actually coming out of your blood into your air sacs in your lungs. Divers with immersion pulmonary edema, there's a case history that was done, a case history series, and divers that were found who have had and been exposed to immersion pulmonary edema. And of those, 68% had underlying medical issues, and 42% of those were people who had cardiac-related issues. So cardiac issues are indeed a significant issue or problem with pulmonary edema. The cause, the exact mechanism is poorly understood or unknown. It's thought to be due to negative pressure in the lungs or negative pressure breathing when you have to pull against a regulator or pull through a narrow diameter snorkel. Signs and symptoms: shortness of breath, cough, a frothy sputum, possibly bloody, that some people could misdiagnose as an arterial gas embolism. Treatment: remove the person from the water, keep them in an upright position. Now, if you've taken a first aid course, they generally tell you to put them in the recovery position on their side or laying down, but not with immersion pulmonary edema. You want to keep them upright because you want those fluids to stay in the lower part of the lungs and not be a problem with breathing. So provide 100% emergency oxygen and contact the local emergency medical services as quickly as you possibly can to get that person to definitive care. And to avoid this, you avoid this by making sure you're not dealing with hypothermia, and that is by using the appropriate thermal protection. Extreme effort in the water, you want to make sure you're not working so hard in the water that you're having to fight to pull that breathing gas through the regulator. You don't want to be overly hydrated. You don't want extra or excess fluid in your body system. You don't want to be using a poorly tuned regulator, so make sure your regulator is tuned properly by a technician at your local dive store. You don't want to make sure you're breathing very, very dense gas by doing exceptionally deep dives or using small diameter snorkels. Or there has been some suggestion that the full face snorkel mask could be a potential problem because you're pulling against negative pressure when you're trying to breathe through one of those. Most at risk: people who've had a previous episode of immersion pulmonary edema, older divers or snorkelers who are over the age of 40, female divers and snorkelers, and those with previous diagnosis of any kind of cardiovascular disease. So heart issues can be a real serious problem with immersion pulmonary edema. Now, the South Pacific Undersea Medical Society and the UK Diving Medical Committee issued a statement recently about their feeling about people who have had immersion pulmonary edema. And in their opinion, SPUMS and UK DMC strongly advise against any further compressed gas diving once you've been diagnosed with an episode of immersion pulmonary edema. So in their opinion, once you've had it, you really should reconsider any future diving. Now, after I saw that, one of the things that I did was I called a number of people and contacted a number of very well-known diving physicians in North America to ask them their opinion. And the opinion is really kind of mixed as to whether or not they would recommend that you stop diving for the rest of your life if you've had immersion pulmonary edema. But it has been published by SPUMS and UK DMC that that is their suggestion. Now, going back on to our major stresses we talked about before, I'll add one more, and that is emotional stress. I think emotional stress from being out of the water for a long time and trying to return at the same level you were when you stopped years before can create enough emotional stress to create an arrhythmia and put you at risk of a cardiac event. So when you look at any of the signs and symptoms of cardiac events, they're almost everything. You normally think of pain in the arm or pain in the chest or some other physical discomfort, but it isn't necessarily the way. For example, an actress, daytime television actress, Susan Lucci, has had 2 cardiac events. The last one she had, the only symptom she had was jaw pain. So it could be almost anything. And in the fatality records, about 25% of the people who suffered a cardiac event had no signs or symptoms whatsoever, and they were totally unaware that they had an impending cardiac event. So first aid for a cardiac incident: locate, recover, and remove the diver from the water. Let's talk briefly about this locate, because in the situation I talked about early on, where they had that group diving in the same ocean buddy system, if somebody gets lost and separated from the group, people don't know where they are, and locating them could take some time and reduce the likelihood that they can be successfully found and resuscitated. There is a company that I'll mention here called Divo that's created a device that's currently under development that automatically inflates a diver's BCD when the diver stops breathing for 45 seconds or longer. Now, you may think about the fact, well, I'm an underwater photographer and I hold my breath when I try to take a photo. Well, most underwater photographers don't hold their breath for longer than about 20 seconds. So after about 45 seconds, then of course, that could indicate that you've stopped breathing, and this device will help bring you to the surface, where it's better to be at the surface than it is, of course, underwater. It's more likely to be resuscitated at the surface than being recovered underwater. And if something happens where you do hold your breath for 45 seconds or longer to take that photograph, you can actually override the system in case it starts to inflate your BCD. Also, it automatically inflates the diver's BCD when the breathing gas gets down to about 72 psig, so that would prevent people from running out of breathing gas underwater. And by the way, I am the dive safety consultant for Divo, and I don't get paid for promoting their product, by the way. Now, going on, again, locate, recover, and remove the diver from the water, CPR, and using an automated electronic defibrillator if necessary. AEDs may be limited depending on where you go. So it's a good idea to maybe call and check to see if there's an AED on the liveaboard you're going to be on or the dive site you're going to. And then get the person to emergency medical services, because, again, they need to get to definitive care as quickly as possible. So why do accidents occur? No recent familiarity with critical skills or equipment. Limited overlearning, because when you take a scuba course, you can only do it so many times. And then from that point on, it's up to you. It's up to you to practice. So when you think about it, when was the last time you practiced the exchange of breathing gas in a diving emergency? When was the last time you practiced removing your weights? When was the last time you practiced any of those complex psychomotor skills? So if you haven't practiced, then it's going to be extremely difficult to use them effectively in a real crisis situation. No recent practice or reinforcement of basic and emergency skills we talked about. And sometimes the focus and attention is away from diving safety. And again, photographers and collectors of sorts sometimes are focused on certain things and not focused on their dive buddies or a dive companion. And so I was giving a talk like this to an underwater photography group not too long ago. And I said, here you are hanging over the drop off, and you've got $30,000 worth of camera equipment in your hands, getting ready to take a photograph, and all of a sudden, boom, this person shows up in front of you and they want breathing gas. They want yours, and they want it right now. So what are you going to do? You've got $30,000 worth of camera gear in your arms. It's going to take at least one hand, maybe two hands, to deal with this person's diving emergency. And so what are you going to do? And these are things a lot of people don't think about, and you need to make sure that you have in some way thought about it. So heaven forbid something like this would ever happen, at least you have some preparation for dealing with it. No recent familiarity with critical skills or equipment, as I talked about. Rehearsal is an important thing to do, because, again, you need to practice these skills. So we used to call it years ago proper pre-dive procedure that we did before every single dive we made. And there are different kinds. For example, one is called static rehearsal. And the static rehearsal is where you are reading about things, you are reading books, you are reading texts about diving and trying to refresh your memory, and also looking at videos.
In the sea, everything is connected to everything else. It is a network of individual organisms bound by the unifying force of the water itself. If we disrespect this openness and diversity, we do so at our own peril. On this day, Bernard is hoping for a glimpse of the rare Sumatran sea badger, when suddenly, disaster. On his own, his equipment unreliable, his inadequate support, Bernard makes a valiant attempt to recover, trying all the fixes he knows, but to no avail. The last thing Bernard saw was not the depths of the blue sea, but the blue screen of death.
Hopefully we'll never see the blue screen of death.
Yeah.
Preferential way of doing this is really dynamic rehearsal. And dynamic rehearsal is where you are actually practicing those skills, whether it's underwater in shallow water or standing on the back of the boat or standing there in shallow water at the shoreline, where you're actually going through to reinforce that muscle memory. So in case something were to happen, you have recent practice, recent familiarity with how those skills are supposed to work. In theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they certainly are not. Deviate from standard pre-dive preparation and protocols. And when we talked before about that group of people who had over 300 open water dives in the 12 months prior to a fatal diving accident, we think that what was going on there was the fact that they had either become very complacent or they had deviated from the standard procedures and practices and protocols that you and I use to make sure we are fully prepared. So whenever I'm on a dive trip, one thing that I want to do is I want to learn about the equipment other people are using. I want them to learn about the equipment that I'm using to make sure that if something were to happen, that they can help me deal with that situation because they have some level of familiarity with the equipment I have. And there is something called normalization of deviance. And the concept of normalization of deviance is something that I heard about when I looked at the National Transportation Safety Board's recommendations from both the investigation of the space shuttle disaster and the investigation of the Conception disaster. And the Conception disaster, of course, was that liveaboard in California that caught fire and cost the life of 34 divers and crew members. And so part of what had happened there was the fact that there was some deviation from standard practices and protocols. So with the space shuttle, they really had an idea that the O-rings were not really going to be working very well when it was cold. They decided to launch. Everything worked properly. There was no problem whatsoever. And so they continued to launch, even though that was in violation of their standard protocol for launching the space shuttle. The same way with the Conception disaster, there were some deviations there from their normal operating procedure that ultimately cost people their lives. So deviations or shortcuts from standard operating procedure become normalized over time. And so when we repeat that, they become normalized because they're done time and time again, and there is no problem. So therefore, they are rewarded. We are rewarded when those deviations don't result in a problem. So we continue to do it because it works until it doesn't. So shortcuts become normal operating procedure over time. And I did write an article in this Scuba Diving Industry magazine about that in April of 2024. And so it's an important thing to understand that we have these protocols in place for a reason, and we want to make sure that we don't deviate from them. When a shortcut works, it works. When it doesn't, the result could be catastrophic. This is actually a screen grab from a video of a group of people who were diving together. Their protocol was at the end of the dive, everybody turns to each other, gives each other the thumbs up. They then look at their diving companion and they follow each other to the surface. So in this particular case, they gave each other the thumbs up and they decided to come up independently, not looking at each other when they were ascending to the surface. And this young lady put her hand on her inflator, held it over her head, and instead of putting a little bit of air in her BCD, she dumped all the air out of her BCD, and then her fins hit the bottom. And once her fins hit the bottom, she went into full-fledged panic. She clawed her way to the surface, ripped out her regulator, ripped her mask off, and she's lucky to be alive, but she survived. And so it's important to make sure you don't violate those procedures and protocols for safe dives. Every shortcut has a price, and usually that price is greater than any reward you get from it. So why do accidents occur? Again, deviate from standard pre-dive preparation and protocols. No pre-dive communication between diving companions. We need to talk to each other and make sure we understand everything we need to understand before the dive begins. No pre-dive equipment check or evaluation. That's a very important part of your pre-dive preparation. No use of a pre-dive checklist or pre-dive ritual to assure proper preparation. I want to make sure that, for one thing, everything about my equipment is the way it should be. Everything about my dive plan is the way it should be. That gives me a lot of comfort and maximizes my enjoyment of the dive because I don't have to worry about things going wrong because my partner and I both check to make sure at least everything we can control is indeed controlled. So, fitness to dive. It's a recommendation that people have an annual physical over the age of 45 from a medical professional who is familiar with diving medicine. And I've emphasized here your life priorities. Your life priorities are very important and very important to you. And so your healthcare professional should understand how important diving is to you. And this is especially important when your healthcare professional or your family physician is not that familiar with diving medicine, because a lot of times they may just say, well, I don't know much about diving medicine. Therefore, I think it's probably a good idea to say, no, don't dive any longer. So it's a good idea for your healthcare professional to have some familiarity with diving medicine. And you can get that information, or that person can get that information from Divers Alert Network. And of course, your evaluation, your physical, should include a periodic cardiac evaluation as well. And I did mine actually last year to make sure everything's working properly, and my physician was very happy and comfortable with my health condition for me to continue diving. Or also, whenever you're having any problem where there's a noticeable or sudden change in your health, whether it's physical or mental, it's probably a good idea to have some evaluation done by, again, a healthcare professional. And that physical, again, can include information from Divers Alert Network, or if you need to be referred to somebody who is a physician trained in diving medicine, Divers Alert Network has a referral network that contains about 700 physicians of all specialties that they can refer you to, or your family physician or your healthcare professional can liaise with the people at Divers Alert Network, and they can give your healthcare professional whatever information they need to make decisions about your health. And so that's a good service that they have. There's no cost for that service, and you can call them anytime, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Also, adhere to safety and conservative practices. The older I get, the more conservative I get, because I want to continue to dive as long as I possibly can. You want to dive within your limits and experience. Again, dive your recent experience, not your certification card. The card is only there as your ticket to be able to go diving. This is a photograph that I took because you want to make sure you avoid diving conditions that may exceed your recent experience or abilities, or whenever there's any question about that. I took this photograph from our dive boat, our liveaboard, when I was diving in Socorro. And it was a day when I got up and the wind was blowing. There was a strong surface current. There was some wave action. And my buddy and I kind of looked at each other and said, we're here to enjoy ourselves, and I don't want to have to work that hard. So we decided to skip the morning dive, and I think it was a good idea on our part. And then we made a dive later on when the conditions were much better and had an absolutely fantastic dive. So you want to make sure that if the conditions really exceed your recent experience, or if there's any question about that at all, that you take an easier approach and possibly think about maybe just making the next dive. Also adhere to safety and conservative practices. I recommend that divers use enriched air nitrox with your dive computer on the air setting, or if you use dive tables still, use air dive tables. I probably have not breathed air on a dive for about the last 8 or 9 years because I think that gives me the level of conservatism that I like to make sure that I fully enjoy those dives with a minimum amount of risk. In fact, it's used so frequently now by older divers, it's been nicknamed geezer gas. And they can call it anything they want. I don't really care. But it's something that I would strongly suggest. In fact, I was on a Zoom call earlier today, and there was a guy on the Zoom call who was talking just about doing this. He said he has started doing that with the classes he's teaching and having his divers use nitrox on the air setting on their dive computer. Also, you need to take a nitrox specialty course because you need to understand the benefits and limitations of diving with nitrox, because there are benefits definitely, and there are certain limitations because it definitely is not a deep diving gas. Use the most conservative options. And I mentioned before that the older I get, the more conservative I get. Practice slow ascents plus safety stops. And remember, you can modify your safety stop and lengthen your safety stop if you think during the dive you've done a little bit more work, you breathe a little more breathing gas, or anything that may affect your safety, you can always do a longer safety stop, as long as it's something you've talked about with your dive companion. This is a photo taken of me on the right-hand side. My buddy and I are diving in the Bahamas a few years ago, and the person behind me is Dr. Jose Jones, the co-founder of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. And Dr. Jones and I are diving together, having had a great dive, by the way, and you can see he's in the full lotus position, and you can see that I'm not. And I'm not nearly as limber. He was actually 75 years old at the time, and I'm not nearly as limber as he is, or he was. And therefore, I'm trying to get my legs up there to be in that lotus position, but I couldn't do it. But I still had a very enjoyable safety stop. Be situationally aware. We talked about that before. Pre-dive preparation, breathing gas supply, bottom time, depth, current, visibility, position, location relative to your exit point, workload, overhead conditions. Also carry safety and signaling equipment. The person on the right-hand side of the photograph is a guy named Bob Evans, who's the inventor of the force fin. Bob and I just finished a dive. We were comparing our safety sausages. You can see that mine is bigger than his. And in fact, the one that I'm using is the Dan safety sausage. And one of the things that we did when I worked at Dan was we developed this safety sausage with a metallic strip in it so that it's visible on radar. Plus, it is bigger and it does have a lot more volume, and therefore it can give you additional buoyancy if you need it at the surface. Also, not a bad idea to have a surface float, preferably with a dive flag to let people know where you are in the water. Or you can use electronic devices. There are things, for example, like the Nautilus Lifeline. I have nothing to do with this company, but it enables you to be able to communicate with vessels within 15 kilometers of where you surface if you're separated from your boat. But boats in the area have to have a receiver. And there are places you go, for example, in the Philippines, where the boats do not have any receivers of any kind. So a device like this would not really work. There's also a Garmin device, the inReach Mini, that actually can initiate air search rescue, air sea rescue, and it also supposedly has a capability of texting for some strange reason. I'm not sure why you'd want to text somebody while you're diving, but it's another device you can use. And there are places, though, where you're not allowed to have any of these electronic devices. So when I ran a group to Cuba this past December, I made sure that everybody did not bring any electronic device with them, because not only would it probably be confiscated, but you could be arrested also like for bringing in electronic devices, which you shouldn't do. And know before you go. And this not only applies to electronic devices, but a lot of other things. For example, if you do a lot of traveling, there are places around the world that really restrict diving based upon your age. There are places that have told me, especially if you arrange a dive excursion from a cruise ship, there's some of these that actually will not allow you to dive if you're older than the age of 70, or there are places that really need to have you show up with a form signed by a physician. So whenever I do my annual physical, I have my physician write me a letter that says, in his opinion, I am medically qualified and healthy enough to be able to scuba dive. And I carry that just in case it's needed. But it's a good idea to know the circumstances when you're going to go someplace to enjoy diving. Take a break after multiple dives and multiple days of diving. You don't have to do every dive. I don't do every dive, and I try to enjoy the dives I do make and not make every dive that's available. Don't be afraid to ask for help, because again, if you're on a dive boat, people are being paid to help you, so take full advantage of that. I like to have a boat that has an easy exit ladder with a pull-up bar to help me out of the water. If I need be, I can don and doff my equipment in the water, especially older people who don't like all that weight on their back, or somebody who has a disability. You can remove the equipment in the water, and they can help you out of the water if need be. You can use different equipment configurations, for example, like side mounts, where you get in the water and you clip that under each arm. You're also streamlined, and you can unclip those when you get back to the surface and don't have to climb out of the water with all that weight on your back. Smaller cylinders, you can use those also. And there is a new device that I'll briefly tell you about called Avelo, the Avelo diving system. And the Avelo diving system, and I did the test dives on this equipment, and that's me actually in the photo on the right-hand side. It's a lighter cylinder. It weighs 15 pounds less than an 80. It works like the ballast tank of a submarine. So water is pumped into the cylinder, compressing a bag that contains your breathing gas and changes your displacement, making you slightly negative. And you don't wear a BC. There's no BCD. There's no drag caused by the BC. There's no mechanics of buoyancy control with the BC and power inflator. You can't overweight yourself. In fact, I took 14 pounds of lead off my weight belt when I'm diving with a wetsuit with that system. Cannot have a rapid ascent because there's nothing that's going to rapidly expand and contract based upon water pressure. And once you're neutral throughout the whole water column. In fact, I did a dive to 95 feet, swam from 95 feet to my safety stop at 15 feet with no change in buoyancy whatsoever. And full disclosure, I am the diving safety consultant for Avelo, and I am not paid to promote their device, but I think it is the future of diving. Safe divers should not be afraid to say no. Remember, anyone can call a dive at any time for any reason. All you've got to do is raise that thumb, the dive is over. The best thing I ever learned in cave diving was once that thumb is up, the dive is over, no questions asked, you exit, and of course then make sure that everybody exiting with you, so the dive then is terminated completely. And I'll end this presentation with what I call the 4 Ps of scuba diving safety. Plan. You need to plan that dive appropriately, having all the information you need to make an appropriate dive plan. If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Prepare, you need to make sure you're fully prepared. You and your diving companions are fully prepared for the dives you're going to make. Practice those skills as frequently as you possibly can. So if you're called upon to use them in a crisis, you can use them effectively and efficiently. Practice wearing and using equipment you commonly dive with if you've been out of the water for a long time. And don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. And perform. You need to make sure you're performing those skills the way you practice them so you can maximize your enjoyment, because that's what we're into this boat for in the first place. We want to maximize our enjoyment, minimize the risk, and continue to enjoy diving for a long, long time. And I'll end this with one way of looking. This is a quote from Sully Sullenberger, who was a pilot of the Miracle on the Hudson, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in 2016. One way of looking at this might be that for 42 years, I've been making small, regular deposits in this bank of experience, education, and training. And on January 15, 2009, the balance was sufficient so that I could make a very large withdrawal and save the lives of 155 people. And this is exactly what we do. So we make those deposits in our bank of experience, education, and training with every single dive we do, every single practice session we're in. We, of course, make those deposits so if the time comes, we not only can use those to have a heck of a dive to enjoy ourselves to the utmost, but also to be effective in case something were to happen so that we can help somebody who needs it, our buddy needs it, and be there in case we need to provide assistance in an emergency situation. So this really is the best thing to do, is simply continue to make those deposits in your experience, education, and training. So scuba diving safety is no accident. And these are a couple books that I published, 101 Tips of Recreational Diving, and also Scuba Diving Safety. And thank you all very much. And my email address is there at the bottom. And please email me if you have any questions whatsoever, and I'll hang around to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, and we don't have a microphone, so I may have to do some
Okay.
conveying of that, but this is recorded and I will have it on our shop YouTube as well later. So if you want to go back and watch any of it.
Okay.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Let's assume talk about, safety stops a bit longer. I'd be interested in his thoughts on, I've read some stuff about deep stops, and what he thinks about that.
Did you hear that?
Deep stops?
Yeah, he was wondering about deep stops. Is there benefits? Stuff like that.
Well, Divers Alert Network actually held a workshop a number of years ago that specifically addressed deep stops. And there were presentations, pro and con. And I guess in my opinion, I think the jury is still out. I think there are some benefits there. When I was actually teaching in Ohio many years ago at Wright State University, we did archaeological projects up in Lake Huron. And all the diving we were doing was to a shipwreck called the Arabia that was in 110 feet of water. And we were making 2 dives a day on that wreck. And what we did was we had restricted bottom time for one thing because the water was very cold, but we'd also do a deep safety stop. So we would do a stop at 40 feet for 1 minute and then continue up to do our regular safety stop. And in my opinion, I think there was some benefit there. We did that for about 10 years and never had any issues whatsoever. And so I do think there is some benefit. The problem is if you start doing a really deep safety stop, then you actually may be absorbing more gas in the long run. The British, many, many years ago, when they first started developing dive tables, they did a stop at half the maximum depth. And so before they started developing the tables that we're using, or similar tables that we're using now. But I think there is some value there, but I'm just not sure if the jury really says they're the thing people should be doing on every dive.
Yeah, well, I guess follow on, because you mentioned different depths for some of them. Is that 40 feet is kind of what you think? I mean, I've heard 40 and 50, but nothing deeper on a deep stop.
Yeah, I mean, again, when we started doing the 40-foot stop, it was just something, and this was back in the 80s and 70s and 80s, actually, we started doing that. And it was just information that I had gotten from some research reports that I had read that talked about the benefits of doing that brief safety stop a little deeper than the 15 feet. Um, but there's not a lot of research available that really shows the true benefit of that. I'm comfortable with it myself because for one thing, it does allow me to have a little bit of additional time to get myself prepared for surfacing. And that was also an issue because one of the benefits of doing, for example, any safety stops has to do with controlling your buoyancy. Because one issue that was a problem for many, many years was rapid ascents. Because people would start towards the surface and all of a sudden, especially in that last number of feet, getting a rapid expansion of breathing gas or gas inside their BC or inside their dry suit, causing that rapid ascent in that last portion of their dive plan and dive profile. So at least the safety stops will help you stop, get yourself organized for returning to the surface and slowing that ascent for that last few feet to the surface.
Excellent. Other questions? Amy?
There hasn't been really much mention of underwater wildlife. We all know the rule, the common sense, look but don't touch. But is there a certain species that causes the most dive injury or accidents?
She's towards the back. I don't know if you heard her.
I didn't hear that.
Wildlife we encounter, we know we're supposed to look and don't touch. Is there one particular animal, species, anything like that is proved to be more dangerous to divers in general that you've come across?
Yeah, other divers. Well, in fact, in the 60 years that I've been diving, for one thing, I've never been eaten by a shark. And I've actually never had a real serious problem with any marine life. Again, the only thing that I'm concerned about are sometimes the other people that are in the water with me. But I've never had, when I was in the military many years ago, I did have a shark that was kind of curious, but I punched him in the nose and he swam away. And I've never had, and I've seen just about every species of shark there is. I've never had a real problem with those. I've never had a real problem with eels or sea snakes. I've seen a lot of those. No, to me, the marine life are really not much of a problem whatsoever. They're enjoyable to look at, great to photograph, but I've never had a problem with them. I know of people who have had situations, but a lot of times it's because they've done something. So there's a good friend of ours who runs a dive operation down in the Florida Keys, Spencer Slate, and Spencer's had a number of problems, largely because he feeds wildlife. And so the wildlife tend to connect him with food, and they're all around him. And sometimes he doesn't have any food, so they take part of his body as food.
Yep.
So he's been bitten a few times, but otherwise, they're really not much of a problem.
No, I know fire coral can be.
Definitely fire coral can be. So I always make sure that my buoyancy is the way it should be. So I avoid touching things. Probably the most problematic thing for hurting yourself would be coming up an anchor line or a mooring buoy line that's been in place for quite a long time because you have marine life growth on it. And sometimes you get fire coral growing on that mooring line. Sometimes you get hydroids on the mooring line. Sometimes you get other things growing on the mooring line that can hurt you. So you just have to be very, very careful.
Absolutely. Great.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
In the South Caribbean, you want to watch out, and you're coming up from a night dive if you have lights off the boat, because that brings the jellyfish up at the surface. And if you're looking up and you're looking up at the light at the surface, you get stung like crazy. But usually when that happens, your guide will know about it. So you really have to watch out. You want to come up with your head down a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah. In fact, the number of places they do that. They do that in the Cayman Islands. There's a number of places that will do that. And so I tend to, when my safety stop is over, we try to get out of the water as quickly as we can. And that's another reason why sometimes I'll carry gloves in my pocket and I'll put the gloves on at the safety stop so that I can get out of the water very quickly. So there's not much skin exposed when I'm at the surface.
Good tip. Yeah. Other questions?
The other problem is sunburn. I've seen people go snorkeling happily around with no t-shirt, no covering or anything, and then they tried to put a scuba tank on top of it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, in the podcast I was part of this morning, there was a guy there as part of that who manufactures some sunscreen and sunblock that's reef friendly, and so they were talking about how important it is to have that, and it really is because sunblock and sunscreen are really, really important, especially if you spend a lot of time in the ocean, a lot of time in places that are very, very warm, a lot of sunlight. In fact, I've had a number of incidents of skin cancer myself, having been, of course, I grew up in Florida for one thing, spent a lot of time down there in Florida State. So you have to really protect yourselves and make sure you're using an SPF of at least 15, preferably 30.
Absolutely. We had Autumn Blum talk to our club last month about her coral care product that she's just come out
Oh,
with.
yeah.
Cream to see. And now I have a question. With Divers Alert Network, we always tell our divers to get it before they go on a trip. And as an instructor and trip leader, I've seen numerous opportunities for it to be used, whether it's dehydration or ear issues or DCS or, skin bends, anything like that. So assuming a diver has Dan and an issue happens and they call that number, what kind of stuff happens on your back end to get that diver the help they need for barotrauma or anything like that? As soon as they call you, what happens next?
Well, I'm assuming they do the same thing as when I was there 11 years ago.
Okay.
So the Dan Medical Department, of course, has the hotline that's available 24 hours a day. And once you call that hotline, you're immediately talking to a well-trained diver medic or sometimes a physician who may be answering the phone. And what they do is they take all the information necessary about the situation that's going on. And they also, of course, take information about where you are, your contact information in case they lose contact with you during the call, so they can call back. And so once that happens, then they'll do whatever they can to help get you to the nearest appropriate medical facility for the treatment of whatever injury you have, or suggest to you how you can deal with the situation. If it's not serious, they can suggest to you about how you can deal with it yourself. But they have information on all of the available hyperbaric chambers. They have information available about all of the clinics and hospitals in the area where you are. They're all over the world, for example, and therefore they can refer you and help you get to the facility you need for the treatment you need. The one thing that I want to mention about that is, in fact, I'm just in the process of putting together an updated article about chamber availability, because the real crisis we have in the diving world today is a lack of available chambers that are available 24 hours a day that will treat injured divers 24/7. Years ago, there were hundreds. Now there were hundreds throughout the United States. Now there are probably a little bit more than 100 throughout the United States. In fact, of those, there are probably only about 60 or 70 that are truly available 24/7 to treat an injured diver who shows up at that facility. And if that injured diver requires advanced medical care, for example, like ventilation, there may even be fewer than 60. And when I was working at Florida State, there were probably a dozen or more chambers available 24/7 throughout the state. Now there are 3. And sometimes that requires a major evacuation to get you to an appropriate facility. So you need to make sure you have all of the information, contact information about Divers Alert Network with you. You need to make sure that your diving companions have all of the information about you and your Dan membership in case you're incapacitated and they have to call for you. So it's important to have all that information available in case, heaven forbid, something were to happen.
And I've noticed now that you can get a tag from Dan that actually has your policy number and you can wear it on your BCD. So you can, your buddy can see your number that has the phone number, everything you need to make that call for you in case you're unresponsive.
Yep. That's very, very important to have all that information available. And also, in fact, one thing I've been trying to do is get the computer manufacturers to have a place inside your dive computer where you can download that information. So it's inside your dive computer. Because when you go to a chamber, that's one thing they take is your dive computer with you. And if that's downloadable, they can download all the information off of your dive computer. And if your medical information is in the computer, that would certainly help. The dive manufacturers don't really want to do that, but but it's something I've been pushing for quite a long time.
Fantastic. Eric, did you have a question? No.
We have those tags, and they are attached to our BCD.
Yeah, those tags help.
They really do. Yeah, I would strongly suggest having one.
Lee, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you expand upon the Avalo system that you mentioned?
He wants you to expand on the Avello.
Velo system. Okay, the Velo system was designed by an engineer, a guy named Aviad Kahana, who was at the time living in Hawaii. And at the DEMA show, the Trade Association show a couple of years ago, I heard about this device that didn't require a BC. So I went to their presentation and I had a lot of questions. So afterwards, I went to their exhibit and their booth at the show. And I said, you know, I have a lot of questions because I want to know whether this is really a safe device to use. And he said, well, we've been wanting to talk to you anyway. So they flew me out to Hawaii to do some of the test dives on this equipment. And I was very skeptical because I'm used to having been diving for all these years, wearing a BC. And so you go through a training session, first of all, to familiarize yourself with the equipment. The equipment is actually two separate parts. You have a cylinder, and then you have what's called a jetpack. The jetpack is a back plate that has a shoulder strap, and it has a battery pack and a pump. And you put the cylinder in this jetpack, you connect the pump to the cylinder, and so once you're in the water, you push a button, seawater is pumped into the cylinder. The cylinder is an aluminum shell, which has a flexible bag on the inside that contains the gas you're breathing, and it's all carbon fiber wrapped. That's one reason why it's 15 pounds lighter than an 80. So when you push a button, water goes into that aluminum shell. It compresses that flexible bag that has your breathing gas and changes your displacement. So it makes you slightly negative. And then once you are in the water column, you can push that button again, or you can evacuate the water out of the cylinder with a valve on the other side until you're neutral. And once you're neutral, you can go anywhere up and down in the water column and not have any change in buoyancy at all. You're perfectly streamlined because you have no drag from the BC. And you take off weight. For example, as I mentioned, I normally wore about 18 pounds of lead with a 5 mil suit. I was down to 4 pounds of lead with that system. And I was neutrally buoyant throughout the water column. And then coming up the ladder, having taken 14 pounds of lead off and a cylinder that's 15 pounds lighter, I was nearly 30 pounds lighter coming up the ladder at the end of the dive.
Wow.
And I ran it through everything I could think of. I told him, I want to dive it when the pump doesn't work. I want to dive it when the battery doesn't work. I want to dive it when this doesn't work or that doesn't work. And when everything failed, the worst I was neutrally buoyant.
Can you
Wow.
adjust the buoyancy though, positive, negative, if you wish?
Can you adjust it to be more positively
Yeah.
or anything?
Yeah. So you can adjust it. In fact, when you're diving, after about half an hour, you breathe about a pound or two of air out of the cylinder. So you are slightly positive. So you push the button to become neutral again, or to become more positive. Like, for example, when I went up to my safety stop, after completing my safety stop, there's a valve on the other side. I evacuated the water out of the cylinder, which caused that breathing bag to expand, making me slightly positive. So I was positive when I got to the surface.
Nice. I have seen some training in Texas. I know Jennifer Idle, she's a fellow Texan. She's real involved in the program.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's like a traveling, try it out in some shops I've seen in Texas. So yeah, why aren't we all using it? Yeah,
Well,
is it expensive compared to?
Yeah, to be perfectly frank, I think, in my opinion now, I think it's the future of diving. Because there's no mechanics of buoyancy control. So with a BC, if you can imagine, every time you go up and down the water column, your BC expands or contracts. You don't have any of that. So you don't have to reach for the power inflator. In fact, the first dive I did with it, I did reach for the power inflator and there wasn't one because I was so used to using a BC. But it is probably a little bit more expensive than buying a cylinder and a backpack that you normally would. And so they are selling it now. You can actually buy it now rather than going to one of these dive centers and renting it. But what I would suggest, if you want to do it, there are dive centers in Florida. There's some in California. There's some literally all over the world. And you can try it out. You take a training course first, which is an online training course that I helped them write. So an online training course. And then once you have the online training course, you get a certificate, you print out, you take it to an Avello instructor. They then will run you through the training program where you make a couple of dives. And then you can rent the equipment in various places and dive with it. But in my opinion, I mean, I think it really is the future of our sport.
Okay, well, the chances, so, you know, I know what can go wrong with my regular old equipment. But are there more things that could go wrong with this system than a regular, BC tank?
He's asking about the number of things that could go wrong. Like with our equipment, we know kind of what to expect, things that could go wrong. Are there more things that could go wrong with the Avella system or fewer?
Fewer, because all you have is a battery pack and a pump. And there are fewer things. All you have to do is, even if the battery pack doesn't work, if something happens during the dive and the battery pack fails for some reason or other, all you have to do is swim to the surface because you're neutrally buoyant. If you need to be slightly positive, you simply evacuate the water out of the system and you become slightly positive. In fact, in the picture, if you remember the picture in the slideshow that had the diver who was over the drop off with $30,000 worth of camera gear, and somebody shows up in front of him who's out of breathing gas, you have to make a choice at that point whether you're going to get rid of that camera gear. If you had the Avelo system, you could bring that person to the surface with one hand.
Oh, wow.
They're neutrally buoyant. So if somebody shows up in front of you, they're neutrally buoyant. You can't overweight yourself. There's no weight you really need to ditch because you're neutrally buoyant. And if you needed to have that person more positive, you simply evacuate the water out of the system and up you go. You can have no rapid ascent. You can't overweight yourself. And it solves a lot of traditional safety problems that we have to worry about in diving.
Now, I know some shops it's available through some shops. When do you anticipate it becoming more widely available?
Well, that's
How
really
many-
up. That's
How
really
many
up to
years
them.
out are we?
Yeah, but I think it's going to be another year probably or so, because with the idea that the company, and Jennifer Idle is part of that, as you mentioned, but the company is going around all over the world to set up these centers, and then I think when more and more people become familiar with it, there's going to be a greater demand, and once there's a greater demand, then it's going to make it financially possible to start making the equipment in bulk. And that's going to, of course, help bring the price down, and so it's probably going to be another year or so before I think it's really readily available. Plus, also trying to convince people that it really is a safe piece of equipment or safe equipment group to be able to use. There are people still a little bit skeptical because it's hard to come to grips with the fact that you can really be neutrally buoyant throughout the whole water column and you don't need a BC.
That's exciting.
It is. It really is. In fact, one of the things I did, I was simulating being a photographer, holding my hands in front of me like holding a camera. My buddy made a noise. I looked up, and there was a whale shark at the surface. I was at 50 feet. And keeping my hands in front of me, I swam up to 50 feet, or excuse me, up to the surface where the whale shark was, back down to 50 feet with no change in buoyancy and not having to move my hands at all. And you cannot do that with
wow.
traditional buoyancy control equipment.
New things.
Yeah.
Any other questions on that?
Did you use similar PSI air pressure? I mean, the max?
Did you use similar amounts of air amount of air during the dive?
My air consumption, by the second or third time I dived it, my air consumption was down lower than it had been before, because there's no drag in the water. No drag in the water. I'm not working hard. I'm not swimming against having all this drag from a BC on me. And in fact, in the thousands of test dives they did, the vast majority of people significantly reduced their air consumption using that device. Because you're throughout the water column.
Carbon fiber?
You said the tank was carbon fiber. Is that correct?
The cylinder itself, there's an aluminum core, so a thin aluminum cylinder in the center, with a breathing bag inside that contains your breathing bag, and then all of that is wrapped by the specially designed carbon fiber wrap. And I'll tell you that carbon fiber wrap is really resilient. I went to their factory or their warehouse, and they actually beat one of the cylinders with a pick, and it barely scuffed the carbon fiber.
Wow. Excellent.
Yeah, it's a little bit longer than a traditional 80. You use a DIN fitting valve, which I think is a safer valve to use anyway. So you actually screw the regulator into the valve because that's a captured O-ring. So I think that's a safer thing to use. The valve and the cylinder is in the backpack backwards as compared to traditional scuba. And the reason for that is that the back plate is so narrow that it would put the regulator against the back of your head. So the cylinder is in the backpack backwards. But you use traditional regulators with it. I use my own regulators with it. I had no trouble at all.
I'm thinking I need to have a whole club meeting just with a velo and call Jennifer. We'll talk to her.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe have Jennifer or one of the people from the Velo
Yeah.
do a webinar for you. I think that would be a good idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the interest is there.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions? I'm going to ask one more just because I've become more involved with the Women Diver Hall of Fame, and I know that you are their ambassador. And I would
I
like
am.
to hear if you could tell them a little bit about it, the organization, and specifically about the scholarships that they like to provide
Wow.
and what they do.
Yeah, the Women Divers Hall of Fame, and as you mentioned before, my wife Betty was in the inaugural class of the Women Divers Hall of Fame, and I am their Goodwill ambassador. And they do have, God, I don't know how many. Hold on, Betty can tell you how many scholarships do they have?
Around 25.
Yeah.
And it fluctuates. But the best way to look at those scholarships is to go to the Women Divers Hall of Fame website, which is
WDHOF.org.
so I have to write it down to do the initials. But go to their website and look at the scholarships. They end at different times of the year. They're for people who've never been diving. They're for people who want to improve their diving. There's photography scholarships, all kinds of scholarships available. And I think last year they gave around $72,000 worth of scholarships.
And you don't have to be a woman in some of these cases to win either.
No,
They're an equal opportunity.
There are a few that are limited to women, but the vast majority are not.
Yeah, I believe over the history of the last 25 years, they've given out $500,000 in scholarships. So we've had two divers come through our shop, do dive master training with a scholarship. So
Oh, really? Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I want to let everyone know those resources are out there, and yeah. So
that's really, really, really good because they do. In fact, they every time we go for a show, for example, Beneath the Sea, we're going there in New Jersey at the end of this month, and Woodruff is having a celebration there for their anniversary, and they're going to be talking more and more about the scholarships they're going to be giving out. They'll be raising money for additional scholarships, and so it's a great opportunity. And again, go to the woodruff.org website, and there's a list of scholarships there and anybody can apply for them.
Yeah, exactly. And they do have a speaker series right now, once a month, interviewing different members of the Women Diver Hall of Fame. There's some excellent discussions going on, and yeah, the discoveries that are going on underwater are just amazing. So
fantastic group.
Thank you. Hi, Betty. We'll meet one day. Any other questions for Dan or Betty?
Yeah, I mean, remember my email address is danorr@danorconsulting.com, and I spend a lot of my time actually answering questions from people, and don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'll be happy to help you with anything.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and really appreciate, and hopefully, I'm sure you'll get some emails, get some good questions.
Anytime.
So I appreciate it. Thank you very
much. Thank you. Everybody have a great evening and enjoy your barbecue.
Really, thank you.
Safe diving.